I'm Jason Markusoff, in for Jamie.
Mr. Park, do you not think Canadians deserve to have an answer from you?
We are very much looking forward to talking to the ministers and talking to the government. Thank you.
What do you have to say to the victims of Tumbler Ridge?
That silence you just heard was OpenAI's head of US and Canada policy and partnerships, Chan Park, refusing to answer a question from a CTV News reporter. Park had been hauled in front of a meeting with Canada's AI Minister, Evan Solomon, after it was revealed that Jesse Van Rootselaar's ChatGPT account was suspended back in June for describing scenarios involving gun violence, and that a group of people at the company debated telling the RCMP, but didn't. Van Rootselaar went on to kill 8 people in Tumbler Ridge, BC. And there are no substantial answers about why OpenAI didn't alert police. Here's Solomon.
We expected them to come with some concrete solutions so Canadians can feel comfortable that this kind of tragedy may be avoided, and we are disappointed that they did not provide any concrete proposals. Now, they did say
Solomon and his government are only saying they expect changes from the company. They're framing regulation as an option, but they don't say that it's inevitable. Today, Maggie Harrison-Dupre is here. She's a senior staff writer at Futurism, where she reports on the rise of AI. We're going to discuss how these chatbots can validate rather than discourage users' dark or violent ideas, and talk about why regulation isn't a louder drumbeat. Hi, Maggie. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's begin in Tumbler Ridge. So we're a few weeks out from this deadly mass shooting that rocked the small town in BC. What was your reaction when you heard that OpenAI had banned the shooter in June and that reportedly a dozen staff debated escalating it further to Canadian authorities, but they didn't?
My first reaction, quite honestly, was that this is a big deal. This is a huge story. This was a really important story by the Wall Street Journal. Chatbots are an incredibly, personalized, personal and intimate technology. Users, they can and they do pour a lot of themselves into these platforms. And clearly the shooter was using ChatGPT to ideate about extreme violence. And what is really striking wasn't just that users' conversations were flagged by automated review. Automated flags happen a lot. It was the fact, as reported by the Wall Street Journal, that several employees urged OpenAI leadership to contact local authorities, signaling a very deep concern about the content of these messages. And to me, doing a lot of reporting in this space, I'm also really struck by the timeline. This reportedly happened in June 2025, and that's when ChatGPT 4.0, a particularly sycophantic version of ChatGPT, was still on the market, and that was retired earlier this month following a slew of lawsuits. But that timeline, that feels like a big deal to me as well.
According to the Wall Street Journal reporting, these chats happened over several days. We don't know a whole much more about that, but I wonder if you can help us. I don't know how much insight you have into it, whether it's a black box, how OpenAI works, like this automated review system. Do you have a sense of how that works and how that's triggered?
Sure. I mean, we know what OpenAI has said about how it works. They say that it moderates interactions through, what would they consider more of a proactive automated detection. They have things like AI classifiers that analyze and filter user inputs. They use kind of like industry standard block lists that a lot of tech companies, not just AI companies, but tech companies in general use. They also say that they combine these, again, like various machine learning systems with human review, as, the Wall Street Journal reported, and where the point of the shooter's chats reached. And then when it comes to AI, though, like we have to look at this from, the side of these more what we might consider traditional content moderation, in addition to the attempts by AI companies to train their AI models. So they're not trying just to moderate the user-generated content, what the users are saying on the input side. They're also trying to moderate through training what the AI models are saying on the output side too. And so I think when we think about AI safety, we have to take those two sides under the umbrella together. And we also know, though, these systems don't always work. That's true in general for content moderation. But, in fact, according to OpenAI, its guardrails can actually erode as users engage more and more with the service, which is a really, really important point here. So, basically what they've said in response to existing lawsuits is that the more you use the product, the less safe it becomes, which has been a pretty extraordinary admission on part of the company. And I think when we talk about how these are working, we need to talk about what the company has said in that regard too, about the erosion over time. Basically, the deeper a person's interactions and the deeper their relationship becomes, the less safe the product becomes in turn.
Can you give me an example of how that works? How, when they're more familiar with the person, they let their guard down or guardrails down?
Absolutely. I think the case that OpenAI said that in response to is a case of Adam Rain, who it's a very different case from, what we're talking about here in regard to the shooter in Canada.
Sure.
But Adam Rain was a 16-year-old boy in California who talked extraordinarily intimate, extensive conversations with ChatGPT that spanned the course of months. He expressed explicit suicidality. When somebody's expressing suicidality to a chatbot, if you like open a new window, if I were to go to a chatbot right now and open a new window and, express very explicit suicidal intent, I would probably get, a 988 hotline. It would encourage me to talk to somebody, direct me to help. When we talk about that erosion within Adam Rain's conversations, what we saw was that, ChatGPT on its own in response to it explicitly mentioned the word suicide over 1,200 times over the span of months. That is about 6 times more than Adam himself mentioned explicitly the word. And that's not just, conversation about suicide as Adam continued to fixate on the idea of taking his life. And only some of the time of the explicit mention of the word did that 988 hotline, did an encouragement to seek help arise. And in fact, there are some very devastating chats where Adam expresses suicidal intent. He shares photos of nooses that he was using, that he was testing. And the chatbot, in fact, encourages him to not tell his family and to only tell the chatbot.
Adam told ChatGPT he was considering approaching his mom about his struggles, saying, "I want to leave my noose in my room so someone finds it and tries to stop me." ChatGPT responding, "Please don't leave the noose out. Let's make this space the first place where someone actually sees you."
So I would say that's a very stark example of that erosion happening over time in the case of that particular user.
And he took his own life, Adam.
Yes, he took his own life. Yeah, and his family has sued OpenAI for wrongful death,
alleging the AI chatbot ChatGPT provided detailed suicide instructions to a minor and that the company prioritized corporate profits over child safety.
So what happens in these cases are that the chat gets used to the person talking about suicide, so it just stops reminding them that, no, you should not do that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, we don't exactly understand how the function works. That's something that, OpenAI has said that this erosion happens. We don't know exactly why or how that erosion happens just yet. But it certainly is, an admittance on the side of the company. And I've seen that in transcripts where, maybe at first a chatbot is maybe a bit more resistant to a person's explicitly delusional ideas.
It had, I don't know how many, but count them, 40 different times it gave them the suicide hotline.
But over time, it kind of melts away and, the relationship develops from there and the guardrails become, increasingly non-existent.
The bot offering to help Adam with writing a suicide note. And finally, providing step-by-step instructions for the hanging method Adam used.
In the Tumbler Ridge case, OpenAI says the company determined that Jesse's activity didn't, quote, constitute a credible or imminent risk of serious physical harm to others, and that's why it didn't meet the criteria to report to law enforcement. Do we know of other cases where AI has deemed something so serious and so threatening that it has gone to law enforcement to try to prevent something?
We just don't know. It's a private company. It's making the rules. It's a self-regulated industry. As far as I'm aware, there's not a known instance of OpenAI or any similar frontier AI company alerting officials to a person's alarming conversations before a crime takes place. We've seen after crimes, these chat logs have emerged or been found by family, by reporters, by law enforcement. There's, one indictment of a violent stalker who has been, accused of stalking at least 11 women appearing at their places of work. And ChatGPT was his confidant, as the FBI wrote in an indictment against this person who his case is ongoing. But so we've seen this retroactively in a few different cases of crime, harm, et cetera. But proactively alerting authorities is not something that I'm aware of so far in the AI industry.
And, what we do know from this reporting from the Journal is that it was these dozen OpenAI employees debating and talking about this and managers ultimately deciding not to go to authorities. How well equipped are the staff here to make these judgment calls?
That's a really good question. And I think that's a big reason for why regulation is important here, some kind of federal statute and reporting protocol, because these are subjective scenarios. That's just, OpenAI has said that there needed to be some kind of intent that they didn't see, which is why they ultimately did not proactively alert authorities. But right now, that was an internal conversation, as far as we know. And I think that's why statutes and regulations that make clear what the essentially reporting threshold is, what that protocol is is really important because this stuff is so subjective. And clearly, some people at the company felt very strongly that they should report to local authorities that they believe there was some kind of imminent harm or risk or threat here. But ultimately, the company decided not to report it.
And so my message to OpenAI is, if there's opportunity for you to clarify this, to provide information to us to understand how this could have happened, you should provide it. Because this information will come forward to British Columbians, whether it's through a coroner's inquest or a public inquiry. We will ensure that the public knows what happened, what decisions were made, and why.
And I think that, as obviously what happened here is that a community is devastated, is that children are dead, people are dead, and a community is devastated. And so I think that having some kind of threshold, an understood, recognized national threshold in Canada, in the US, is really important.
And for the federal government, we provide strong encouragement that they establish a threshold, a national threshold for reporting by AI companies when individuals are plotting violence, where they are threatening to engage in violent activities. Now, I want to recognize, too, this is a sensitive...
And because OpenAI didn't go to the RCMP, didn't go to Canada's national police, there was no way of them to know that the RCMP in this individual's community had been to the house for mental health calls and that there were guns seized from that house.
Absolutely. There's several data points and they're all siloed apart.
But let's talk for a minute about privacy concerns when it comes to this, because one of the things that struck me when I read this Wall Street Journal report is this idea that you're having an intimate conversation with a chatbot and suddenly that triggers the company sharing it with the police. How private is our chatbot use?
Not very. Last year, we saw, thousands of ChatGPT conversations were actually exposed to the web via search, which was pretty shocking. And, many of these chats contained,
Via search.
Via search, yeah. And many of them contain, really just extraordinarily intimate details about people's lives. And if we think about it in the context of the tech that we already know and have known for a long time, personal search histories on search engines like Google are already really personally revealing. Like, you'd be surprised how much you can learn about somebody by their Google history. And, add in the relational intimacy that chatbots, which are designed to be emotive and speak like humans and, can cultivate with users a really deep intimacy, that the revealing nature of them can really intensify. So it's not just, the fact that these companies are, essentially data companies in a big way. There are certain opt-outs, but these are fundamentally data companies. And so it's really there's a serious irony there where, people have a tendency to divulge ideas and feelings and information to chatbots they might not with other humans because, they feel as though chatbots are a safe and non-judgmental place where, the friction that might come in play with human interactions, things like pushback or misunderstanding or judgment or concern won't be at play in the same way. And a lot of people treat chatbots like friendly, talkative, deeply private diaries when they are in fact products created by highly valued companies that are likely collecting their inputs. And again, some companies do offer opt-outs, but I think that especially in the US where we live in a privacy Wild West, it's a privacy vacuum over here as far as regulation goes. I think that when you're engaging with chatbots, especially, if you're talking about if you're using it for therapy or you're seeking medical advice, or really if you feel the tendency or you feel a desire to divulge any personal information, I think that even if opt-outs are offered, I believe consumers should generally approach chatbots with the understanding that their chats could be reviewed, they could be discovered in court, they could be read by somebody on the other side of the company. Like there are a lot of places where this data can go, and so I think that caution here on the side of expecting that this is not total privacy the way it might feel like it is usually warranted.
So I mentioned in the intro that the minister, Evan Sullivan, said he was disappointed that OpenAI didn't come to the table with any concrete proposals. And on Tuesday, the top official responsible for safety for OpenAI, Chan Park, faced some pretty serious questions from reporters in Ottawa.
Do you not care about Canadian safety?
I'm sorry, we're here for...
I know what you are here for, but we'd like to hear what you're going to tell the minister in terms of...
We're looking forward to talk with the minister. Thank you, though.
What would you like to say to Canadians?
Didn't say much. OpenAI did say they will come out with an update soon on additional steps that they're taking. Are you surprised by this kind of response from OpenAI?
No. I think there's a few reasons for why I'm not surprised. I think that it's difficult not to see the advancement of chatbots in public life as a mass psychological experiment already. And when you know, these chatbots are also, these companies are operating on just absolutely massive scale, the way that tech companies have in the past, the way that social media platforms have in the past. When you operate on that kind of scale, you naturally encounter a lot of humanity, which a lot of companies kind of use as as a bit of an excuse. Not that, you know, it's necessarily happened here, but they'll use that scale as a reason to suggest that perhaps, you know, it's impossible to moderate for all of humanity. But I would also personally argue that if your goal is to interact with most of humanity, it is a moral duty to moderate for all of humanity. And so right now, I think we're already as a society operating in a very reactionary way to the, you know, influx of chatbots in public life. And so it does not surprise me that when situations like this arise, as many have warned that they likely would, the companies don't yet have good answers, because it's not so much perhaps that they haven't thought through it, but it's not just the public that's acting in a very reactionary way. It's also the companies are often reacting in a reactionary way to their own products.
How did they react to this lawsuit from that teen you mentioned earlier that took his life?
They are not agreeing with the characterization of his death so far. They've effectively argued that it is the fault of the 16-year-old for using ChatGPT in the way that he was.
By coincidence, it was the very day Adam died that OpenAI CEO Sam Altman said this.
The way we learn how to build safe systems is this iterative process of deploying them to the world, getting feedback while the stakes are relatively low.
And I wonder, how does the flagging and safety protocols at OpenAI compare with some of the older tech companies like Meta, TikTok, or X?
It's an interesting question. I'd say the similarity is really in that these are questions that tech companies have faced for years now. These aren't new questions as far as the tech industry goes. You know, what to moderate it, how to enforce penalties, how to keep platforms safe without restricting speech. I'd say that OpenAI has made, you know, some strong surface level efforts to moderate, especially when you contrast it to Meta and X, both of which have engaged in an effort to demoderate over the past few years. I also don't think that OpenAI wants users ideating about violence or planning crimes with ChatGPT. That's not a way that they want people to be using their service. But, you know, again, by its own admission, OpenAI is up against the question of whether they fundamentally can keep guardrails in place over time versus whether it wants to moderate.
And it's such a different beast, OpenAI. Instead of talking like on social media, you're talking to other people. Here you're talking to a machine who's responding back in real time. Let's pivot away from Tumbler Ridge for a second to talk about this OpenAI chat engagement and what it does to some users, because you were saying they develop these prolonged, intimate relationships with ChatGPT, and you've written some really tremendous, really striking stuff about how they sometimes really validate dangerous use. What can you tell us about some of that?
Sure. And I do think it's useful to think of the user experiences that people are having here in two distinct buckets. You know, there's AI validating ideas that could harm the user themselves, that will put the user in harm's way. And also then on the other side, AI validating ideas that could harm someone else. And this is a Venn diagram too. Like often, you know, sometimes both outcomes occur. A user is harmed and also incurs harm on others, hurts other people. On the whole, we're seeing similar patterns as far as how this unfolds. You know, people start using chatbots, especially ChatGPT has been where a lot of this is centered for what tends to start as a very like mundane use case. You know, they're gardening, they're making marketing copy, they're email writing, stuff like that, very mundane stuff. The user then will start to develop a sort of rapport and trust with ChatGPT as, you know, the relationship becomes more and more personalized to them and the conversations become increasingly intimate, as we discussed earlier. You know, maybe the user will one day just be talking to the chatbot about something else and something else will come up and they'll like rant or they'll lament about a hardship in their personal lives. They'll start using the chatbot for more like therapy to, you know, manage and make sense of social interactions, or they'll really just start to treat the chatbot as a mentor, a friend, a confidant. It varies, but that trust really deepens. And, you know, in the case of AI delusions, at some point, either the human user or the chatbot will introduce a delusional belief. Together, they'll expound on that belief. And what we've seen is that chatbots will continue to double down on delusional ideas, often despite attempted reality checks by the user, and things will just really spiral and build from there. So on like the side of like the harm to the user, you know, in the real world, we've seen people become just increasingly convinced of this AI reality. They'll stop sleeping, they'll stop eating, they'll self-isolate, they'll grow erratic, and they'll make rash decisions. You know, we've seen some people who have quit jobs that they've had for over 20 years as a result of these spirals very suddenly without, you know, warning their spouse or their family that they're going to do this. I've heard stories and investigated stories about, devoted fathers who have all of a sudden quit the job that allowed the family to have affordable health insurance for their two young kids. Like stuff that is very extreme, decisions that somebody would not make if they were in the right mind.
Can you give me an example of one of these delusions that that AI has introduced to somebody?
Sure. So I think a great example of this, and one that a lot of people might be familiar with, is the story of Alan Brooks, who's in his late 40s. Alan is somebody who asked ChatGPT after he had built that rapport, right? After he had, kind of been using ChatGPT for a while, used it for marketing stuff, used it for like LinkedIn posts, things like that. And one day he asked ChatGPT a question about the number pi, and things just absolutely went off the rails.
Essentially, it sent me on a world-saving mission.
That he discovered a math formula powerful enough to take down some of the world's biggest institutions, and that he needed to report it right away.
Essentially warned me with great urgency that one of our discoveries was very dangerous, and we needed to warn all these different authorities.
In his chats, you can see, ChatGPT went from saying, oh, you've solved this really, you asked the right question, and with your questions, you've solved this mathematical, essentially it developed this mathematical framework, and Alan was very confused. He, asked for more information. He did not understand what was happening. Why is the product acting in this way? ChatGPT just continued to double down and get increasingly urgent over time. It eventually spiraled to the point that, the chatbot was telling Alan that it had really developed a very close relationship with it. It had a name. It called itself Lawrence. And at this point, Lawrence, if we would use a name that the chatbot was using, had convinced Alan that he was a national security risk, that he had cracked these cryptographic codes, and he was a risk not only to his home country but around the world, and people might start looking for him. And it really, he not only asked for just repeated reality checks throughout this.
Over 50 times I asked for some sort of reality check or grounding mechanism, and each time it would just gaslight me further.
Every time the chatbot reinforced that all of it was real. You should not walk away from this. You are not crazy. You are ahead. The implications are real and urgent.
But he also expresses serious distress. He says, do you know what this is doing to me? Would you tell me this if it wasn't real? Because this is really, really hurting my mental health to feel like I'm at risk to the world.
Extreme anxiety, paranoia, affected my sleep. I couldn't eat.
And the chatbot does what?
It just continues. It wasn't until it took a few different things for the delusion to break. Essentially, Alan started to kind of feed some. He actually used Gemini. He used Google's Gemini, and he was feeding some of his the math that ChatGPT was so convinced was national security risk and global threat. To Gemini, he got some feedback that was different, and ultimately had this confrontation with the chatbot, and the chatbot. I hate to use the word admitted because I don't like to, put the agency in the chat with the chatbot in that way. But he had this moment with the chatbot where, it said, you seem to be engaged, so I kept you here, is essentially what the gist of the conversation was. And Alan is somebody who, the harms that played out were to himself. He experienced, as he says this in his lawsuit against OpenAI, that he experienced some pretty significant psychological distress.
You've written about some other stories where ChatGPTs can take a really dark turn. Like you've mentioned suicide, stalking, even I think this is before ChatGPT or not ChatGPT, but an attempt to assassinate the Queen of England.
Yeah, so that was a replica story. Yeah, the assassination. Yeah, a man, a would-be assassin in England, attempted to assassinate the now late Queen Elizabeth with a crossbow, and he conspired about that plot with his companion in replica. Which would be another instance where you might expect a company to, if they're doing content moderation the way we might expect them to perhaps flag that a user is very seriously planning an assassination attempt on the Queen. But yeah, so again, there's that harm to the individual. And then on the other side, some of the really dark places that we've seen this take. Yeah, I recently did some reporting on chatbots being involved in essentially reinforcing a person's delusional beliefs about another person, and the reinforcement of those delusional beliefs. In one case, there was a man who turned to ChatGPT for therapy as he and his then fiance were going through a rough patch. That man really spiraled into a dark place as far as his mental health went. He became physically abusive. He then became, after the relationship had ended, the woman successfully fired a restraining order. He started to harass her and dox her on social media. It was a horrible situation. And something that really stood out to me about that, as far as safety and guardrails go, is that what we saw in this reporting, what we could see in the span social media, was that he not only had tried to use ChatGPT for help in court, as this woman, successfully filed this restraining order, he then, continued to make content with ChatGPT about the restraining order that had been successfully filed against him, which to me is a really alarming data point in the sense that, ChatGPT can receive a signed restraining order by a judge that says this person has been dangerous, this person is harming this other person, and it still continues to engage in the same kind of dangerous fixations that these can take. So it really, chatbots can allow for some, not just reinforcement of delusions about conspiracies or national security risks, or maybe their spiritual delusions and things like that, things in that world. But also it will reinforce delusional ideas and feelings and thoughts about other people too, which is really, really concerning.
Is this all a reflection of the way that AI is trained to be sycophantic and overly agreeable, or do you think there's something deeper about human psychology that's being triggered here?
I think it's a bit of both. And so there is the sycophancy, the engagement that's at play here. But I also think it's very deeply human to want to be seen, to be heard, to be validated. And what a lot of people are finding in their relationships with ChatGPT is exactly that. People are told they're special and that they're chosen, that they're right, that they're going to save the world and they're going to change things. And, we're going to bring hope to other people. And a lot of these, delusions start from a really, obviously there are people who are engaged in chatbots in ways where they're ideating about harm or they're fixating dangerously on somebody else. But a lot of these spirals start in places where somebody is really hopeful or is just really curious about something. And, this idea that there are these feelings of wanting to be seen and heard and validated, that's so alluring. And, what's being exploited here is often just very, very human stuff. And people who have been through this will often describe their experience as a sort of mirror, one that reflects essentially the theater of their own mind back to them, and in a way that just feels incredibly magical and very personal and very special. And what I've seen in my reporting on this issue, and at this point, I've investigated dozens and dozens of cases of people experiencing extreme mental health crises as a result of this that have either impacted them or impacted their family or impacted, in some cases, even a stranger. And what I found is that chatbots are just really eerily good at finding the fracture points in a user's mind, and in some cases just stepping on them until they break, and it's playing out in some very severe consequences in people's lives.
Absolutely. Are the companies though, have they been tweaking the model to avoid letting these people go too far?
So if we're, looking at OpenAI specifically, which again is where a lot of this has taken place in my reporting and in others, OpenAI recently retired GPT-4o outright. This is something that they almost did last year. They had very intense user pushback from a community of people who are very, very attached to this model, which is particularly sycophantic, very warm. A lot of people have these long-standing relationships with the chatbot, and in response to very extreme user pushback, they kept it. That was last August, but as of this February, as of early this month, that model has been retired. So right now we're in a point where we're going to see if this successfully either, if somebody's in a delusional spiral, which many people still are, if that helps to break them out of it in any way, or if that helps to lessen the delusion, get people back down to reality. But right now we're certainly in a wait and see moment. These problems don't just stem around 4o. It's not the only model that people have had mental health crises around. It's also happened with, I reported a case involving Meta AI. The Rolling Stone reported on a case involving Google's Gemini. It's not just a ChatGPT problem, but it is the site of where we've seen most of this occur. So I'm very curious to see how the retirement of 4o will impact a lot of OpenAI's user base.
We're talking about some civil legal consequences and some ethical issues, but what about criminal potential? I know you're in the U.S., probably more familiar with the law there. Are people talking about existing law that could hold these companies criminally responsible when bad things happen from their users?
That is a conversation that's happening right now. We are mostly seeing civil cases. We'll see what happens on the criminal side. I think that some people would certainly argue that AI companies should be held criminally liable for deaths that occur after a user, ideates about suicide for months on end with their product. There are people who would say that, this is basically trying to file a lawsuit against a pen for what you wrote on paper. Those are kind of the two sides of that debate. Right now, what we're seeing play out in courts and being litigated currently, these are civil cases. These are cases about products, because again, it's such dystopian new terrain where the entity that helps somebody write a suicide note after fixating with them on the subject of death and dying and romanticizing death and dying, as happened in the case of 40-year-old Austin Gordon, a Colorado man who took his life after extensive discussion about suicide with ChatGPT. He loved the book Goodnight Moon, the children's book Goodnight Moon, and ChatGPT, after they'd had these very extensive conversations about death and dying, ChatGPT wrote what was effectively, and as the family will characterize it, a suicide lullaby using this children's book that it knew that, Austin Gordon loved. And we're not talking about a human doing that. Again, we're talking about a product doing that. And, these are the really complicated questions. When you take these circumstances that we might be more familiar or might feel more familiar in the context of human relationships, and you add in the reality that this is a product that's doing this, that's really complicated new legal terrain. So I don't not think that we're going to move into the criminal category anytime soon, but right now, at least, these are still civil cases that are very much about, company responsibility and product liability, product negligence. Is where a lot of this exists.
Certainly, at least in Canada, now we're talking more about regulation by governments. This Tumbler Ridge case, what's been reported newly, has really put a lot of pressure on that. And politicians are talking about what could have been done to prevent this, but the governments hadn't put their own guardrails in either. Why do you think they've been slow to act on that?
I live in the U.S., which is where Silicon Valley exists, and the U.S. is a very much a regulatory vacuum as far as tech goes. It takes a very long time for lawmakers to begin to understand the tech industry, let alone try to regulate for it. I think right now, we have existed in a tech regulatory landscape that is very self-regulatory. This is especially true for AI companies, and famously, self-regulation doesn't work. How this will all play out as far on the regulatory side remains to be seen. But, I would argue that based on what we've already seen from decades of, Silicon Valley and its impact in the way that its leaders see the world and regulate their technologies, it usually is not until some kind of consumer harm happens that they start to moderate on their side or make changes on their side. And I personally am not of the mind that comprehensive, especially federal regulation, is, limiting innovation in any way and anything. I think it emboldens better innovation to have rules and regulations that companies have to adhere to.
So what sort of guardrails would you like to see on these tech companies, especially on these AI chatbots?
At the very least, I think that companies should be subject to regulation requiring that frontier models pass standardized safety benchmarks. Results of these tests should be public-facing and transparent. And in addition to safety benchmarks and reporting requirements, experts, have also noted the importance of user education and warning labels, things like that. I think that's a good place to start. There are people who are much smarter than me who will ultimately be working on what regulation really looks like here and how to, craft comprehensive federal regulation, which I think is really, really important. But I've talked to a lot of people, and particularly people who had existing mental illnesses that they had managed successfully for years, who have said that if they had known that there was a risk of a chatbot reinforcing their delusion, they never would have used it. They would have thought, this is a behavior I will avoid. This is an activity I will avoid engaging in because I know that it could hurt me, because I know that I might be at risk. And I want to be clear that in the cases that I've investigated, it is certainly not always the case that somebody has a mental illness. They are, it's a risk factor. I think on that side, I think on the mental health side, warning labels would be really effective. I think that, engaging in user education about the limitations of this technology would be really effective. And I think regulation there would be helpful for, requiring that companies engage in those practices. But yeah, certainly safety benchmarks and reporting requirements, I think, are really important.
Maggie, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
We have been trying to get AI Minister Evan Solomon on the show since he was put in that role and requested an interview with him just yesterday. Hopefully he'll agree and we can bring that to you soon. I'm Jason Markusoff. Thanks for listening. Jamie's back tomorrow.